Hello, my name is Caine Barlow. I'm an Australian Mycologist and Fungi Educator. In this video I'm talking about Amanita muscaria, the archetypal magic mushroom. This mushroom is highly recognisable. It has a beautiful red cap. It has those very distinctive white warts or spots, and is found in numerous parks and gardens all over the world. It's featured quite regularly in children's picture books. It turns up in the illustrations of numerous fairy tales, and it also turns up in quite a few cultural myths as well. It's a mycorrhizal species, which means that this mushroom lives in symbiosis with trees. So quite often pine, birch, spruce, and other species as well. Amanita muscaria is regarded as being poisonous, but there's a few things to point out here, and I will come back to the pharmacology in a moment. But on the whole, although it's regarded as poisonous, it's safe to pick up and handle. It's not going to poison you. In fact, some people regard it as edible. David Aurora, for example, in his papers and his books, describes how you can prepare it for frying up and eating, for example. Amanita muscaria also has an associated species, Amanita pantherina. So rather than that beautiful red and white cap, it's a brown and white cap. The thing with Amanita pantherina is that it's quite stronger, and there are a lot more lookalikes. Amanita muscaria is known to be a species complex. We now know from genetic studies that there are numerous species now described under that one name. In some parts of the world, for example in Tasmania, Victoria, it's becoming a weedy species and is becoming invasive in some areas. It's also skipping hosts. So it's jumping onto Nothofagus, for example, in Tasmania, New Zealand, and it's also recently been noticed to be jumping onto eucalyptus. So to describe Amanita muscaria, the cap is globose to hemispherical, and then in time it flattens out, and in some cases it curves upwards. It's about 80 to 20 centimetres in diameter, often bright red, fading to orange with age. This is due to rain washing away those pigments on the top of the cap. And it's covered with those very distinctive white warts. The gills are white with a free attachment, so they're not attached to the stem, and they have a really beautiful white spore print. The stem is white. It's 5 to 20 centimetres high by 1 to 2 centimetres thick. It's slightly brittle with a fibrous texture. It's cylindrical, hollow, and it has that very solid bulbous base. As the cap opens, as it goes from being globose to hemispherical, the partial veil falls away, leaving that very distinctive annulus or skirt. As mentioned, Amanita muscaria is a species complex. There are now known to be numerous varieties that may be species in their own right. So we have Amanita muscaria var muscaria. This is the Euro-Asian fly agaric, which is the bright red fly agaric from Northern Europe and Asia, and quite possibly the one that's present here in Australia. There's also Amanita muscaria var flavivolvata. This is the US fly agaric. It's red with yellow to yellowish white warts. It occurs from Alaska through to the Rocky Mountains, and then from Central America to Andean Colombia. Another is Amanita muscaria var gesawii, which is a yellow variant of the US fly agaric. It's found in northeast North America, so Newfoundland and Quebec down to the state of Tennessee. Amanita muscaria is a temperate species, so it occurs in the cooler parts of the world. It appears in autumn as the deciduous trees their metabolism starts to slow down, their leaves start to go brown to yellow and then to fall off. This process of the deciduous trees going into their winter period triggers the fruiting of the Amanita muscaria, and then they start to pop up through lawns and etc. As mentioned, Amanita muscaria is a mycorrhizal species, so it grows in association with pine, birch, spruce and other trees. It typically occurs in pine forests, arboretums that feature many of these European deciduous trees. But it's also quite common on suburban lawns where people have birch growing as a feature tree. They are also found on roadsides and in cemeteries, typically because of Pinus species, which is a weedy tree, and hence the fly agaric tend to follow them. In Australia, Amanita muscaria occurs in Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales, possibly WA, and in New Zealand as well. As mentioned, it is potentially jumping hosts, and many mycologists are looking for more info on this, particularly in the case where Amanita muscaria is found growing at the base of eucalyptus. The season for Amanita muscaria is March through June. It's that time of the year when the deciduous trees are losing their leaves. The history around Amanita muscaria is very long and complex. We can only assume the human relationship with fly agaric is ancient and timeless. It was named originally Agaricus muscarius by Carl Linnaeus in 1753. The musca meaning fly, and we'll come back to that in a moment. It was then placed in Amannita by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1783, and this was then further sanctioned by mycologist Elias Magnus Fries in 1821. Amanita muscaria is now a global species. It's been introduced to numerous countries via the transportation of these host trees. It is now increasingly regarded as problematic where it's introduced due to the fact that it's so weedy, but also potentially jumping hosts. The cultural history of Amanita muscaria is likely also timeless. Its name derives from its use in killing flies by dropping fragments of the cap into glasses of milk. The milk it supposedly attracts the flies, and then the compounds in the mushroom then supposedly kill the fly. Gordon Wasson claims that the cultural usage of Amanita muscaria can be traced linguistically back to approximately 6000 BC, but it's likely that its use goes back a lot longer than that. The first ethnomycological reference is from 1730 from Philipp Johann von Strahlenberg, who has an account of its use by the Koyaks of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The word shaman is probably derived from the Tungusic word saman, meaning one who knows. But this word has become slightly problematic, and it's been misappropriated and is now used to refer to plant medicine practitioners all over the world. Modern cultural interest essentially boomed in the late 1800s, particularly through the publication of The Seven Sisters of Sleep by Mordecai Cook, which led in time to the publication of Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland particularly kind of helped promote this kind of interest and use in Amanita muscaria in the 1960s due to the visionary nature of the story. So a little bit of history on that. Muscarine was discovered in 1869, and it was the compound thought to be the active compound, as it binds with muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. The symptoms of muscarine poisoning include headache, nausea, vomiting, constriction of the pharynx, tremors, convulsions, and in some cases death. But again, I'll come back to that point about muscarine being reported in Amanita muscaria in insignificant amounts. Species of greater concern for muscarine poisoning are species such as Inocybe and Clitocybe. The pharmacology of Amanita muscaria is quite interesting, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, not a lot, but enough just to cover the basics. The principal alkaloids are ibotenic acid, muscimol, muscarine, and some sources also mention bufotenin. Ibotenic acid is the prodrug of muscimol. So through heat, through the drying process of the mushroom, the ibotenic acid is converted to muscimol. You can see here on the slide the differences between the two compounds. So through carboxylation, the ibotenic acid is then converted to muscimol. It loses that carboxyl group. It is known that muscimol and ibotenic acid are lethal in very high doses, but this is known through rat and rabbit studies, and there is no data for humans in this aspect. The other compound, muscarine, is reported to occur, but only in very insignificant amounts. Ibotenic acid is a potent NMDA agonist, and also an agonist of 1 and 2 metabotropic glutamate receptors. It is considered neurotoxic, hence why the traditional use of the mushroom is purely with the dried mushrooms, and any other use, it's recommended that they're dried out before consumption. So ibotenic acid is converted to muscimol through that decarboxylation process. Muscimol is an agonist of GABA receptors, acting as a neurotransmitter for GABA-A. There are a lot of myths and modern narratives based around Amanita muscaria, and unfortunately I can't go into very much detail in this particular presentation. But the best known myths and narratives are that Amanita muscaria was thought to be the Soma of the Rig Veda. There's been a lot of discussion about this and a lot of literature covering that. Probably one of the more pertinent points is that Terence McKenna, in his book Food of the Gods, points out through his own use of Amanita muscaria that the effects of Amanita muscaria do not describe the effects described for Soma in the Rig Veda. Another well-known myth is that the Viking beserkers were thought to have consumed Amanita muscaria before running naked into battle. Yet another, and this one a little bit more recent, through the works of John Allegro, Sacred Mushroom of the Cross, is the idea that Jesus was essentially a mushroom, and that Christianity was originated from a fertility cult. Another interesting and humorous myth around Amanita muscaria is the idea that Santa Claus may have been a shaman, through the association of the reindeer eating the fly agaric almost aggressively in some cases, and the jolly nature of Santa Claus with his beautiful red coat with white lining, which is very muscaria-like in appearance. We also have the modern narratives of Alice in Wonderland, in which Alice is thought to be undergoing the experience of the Amanita muscaria experience. And then more recently, the Mario brothers with the 1-up and the 2-up mushrooms. I include a link here to some interesting media as well, particularly the Dr. Spong Dream Flower. This is quite an interesting podcast. I'm going to show you a couple of slides. So this first slide is a cross-section of an Amanita muscaria. You can see that kind of fibrous nature of the stem. You can see the gills that are not attached to the stem. And then that beautiful red cap. Here's some Amanita muscarias in habitat. So these are in a graveyard at the base of a Pinus radiata. You can see the mushrooms in various stages of growth. So the small globose mushrooms, and then the flattened cap, and then also the upturned cap that are starting to turn orange or even kind of yellow in colour. Amanita muscaria does have a few lookalikes. In Australia, the main lookalike is Amanita xanthocephala, as illustrated here on the right in this slide. It's more orange in colour, but it does definitely have that red colour coming through in the cap. You can see that particularly on the far right mushroom. But it also has that yellow-orange coloration on the stem, on the stipe, whereas Amanita muscaria is typically very, very sharply white. I mentioned here also Amanita pantherina, which is an associated species. This does have a lot of lookalikes, so I would be very, very cautious collecting any of those. Another common lookalike is also Loradiomyces ceres, which can look like very small Amanita muscaria. And another lookalike, perhaps more pertinent to overseas viewers, is Amannita Persinia, the peach-coloured Amanita. In some cases, Amanita muscaria can lose its white warts, and so it can look like the sought-after edible Amanita caesarea, and it can also look like numerous russula species, particularly those beautiful red russulas. An example being Russula sanguinea. Before going out foraging, my advice is to identify your target species, the species that you're really interested in going out and looking for. And then alongside that, also identify their potential lookalikes, so that when you're out in the field, you can identify the features of the ones that you want, but then if you come across those lookalikes, you can easily tell the difference. Here we have Amanita muscaria, the archetypal magic mushroom. The mushroom that inspires so many stories of fairies and goblins and other mythical tales through history. It has that beautiful red cap with those really lovely white warts, these little speckles that are remnants of the universal veil. If we look here at this mushroom here, this is an Amanita muscaria that's just emerging from the soil. You can see it has these cracks in the universal veil as the cap is expanding. that universal veil is cracking, and you can see the red, that beautiful red colour emerging from underneath. In time, this cap will expand. Unlike this specimen over here, the cap will become globose. You can see that the cap's expanded, the red's starting to show, and those warts, the remnants of the universal veil, are starting to spread apart. In time, it'll start to look like this, where the cap is a little bit more than hemispherical. You can see the cap is slightly more than semi-hemispherical. It's going to expand and it's going to slowly flatten out, and will in time look like something like this here. In fact, this one's starting to upturn a bit. It's got a little bit of a cup in the middle and it's gathering water. You can see that the mushroom here in this state is also starting to lose some of that red colour. It's going slightly orange and slightly yellow. You can see here also the margins of the cap. You can see those gills starting to show through. If we pick one of these mushrooms, and you can see here at the base of the mushroom, so this is the base, so this would have formed part of that universal veil. There's some little remnants left on the stem. Further up the stem we have the annulus, this kind of partial veil here that would have protected the gills while the cap was developing within the universal veil. We have these beautiful white gills. They're really distinctively white, and if you focus in, you can see that the gills have a free attachment. They're not attached to the stem. And then of course there's that beautiful red cap with those white dots, those white warts, the remnants of the universal veil. Incredible, stunning mushroom. Now we can see the inside of the mushroom. We have that kind of beautiful red cap, and we have this yellow coloration underneath that red layer. We can see the gills here with this free attachment. They're not attached to the stem at all, they're just attached to the underside of the cap. The bulbous base, and then we have this slightly hollow stem. This is a really beautiful, highly ornamental species that's really lovely to find when it pops up in your front yard or in your local park. This slide has quite a few books that go into Amanita muscaria in some detail. So first off, there's The Seven Sisters of Sleep by Mordecai Cook. This is the book that was the basis of Alice in Wonderland. Mushrooms, Russia and History by Valentina and Gordon Wasson also mentions Amanita, and also just that whole lovely European culture around mushrooms. Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality by R. Gordon Wasson goes into a lot of cultural history about Amanita muscaria, covering those aspects of use in Siberia, and then more the use in the Rig Veda. Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by John M. Allegro is the book mentioned that talks about Jesus being the mushroom. A really good reference is Pharmacological by Jonathan Ott, who covers a lot of the cultural history of Amanita muscaria and a lot of the modern literature. Magic Mushrooms by Clark Heinrich goes into a lot of other cultural uses. So the potential use of Amanita muscaria in India, the Rig Veda, and other cultures. Shroom by Andy Letcher then goes into myth busting a lot of stuff around Amanita muscaria, so particularly the John Allegro narrative. Radical Mycology by Peter McCoy also talks about Amanita muscaria. And a couple of more recent books, Wild Mushrooming by Alison Pulio and Tom May has a beautiful section on how to identify Amanita muscaria in detail. There's numerous photographs that help to identify those particular features. And lastly, Fly Agaric, edited by Kevin Feeney, is just a really beautiful compendium of essays around the history, pharmacology, mythology, and general exploration around fly agaric. Amanita muscaria is regarded as a poisonous species. If you go through numerous ID guides, it will be listed as poisonous or toxic, and in some cases will have a little skull and crossbone icon to indicate that. It's a misunderstood species, and there is a long cultural history of usage of this mushroom. It's okay to pick it up, to hold it. You're not going to absorb any of the toxins through your skin, although, as with many mushrooms, it's advised that you maybe wash your hands afterwards. It has a long cultural history of usage and consumption. There's lots of cultural discussion around this mushroom, but we do not recommend the picking or the consumption of this mushroom. Although there are environmental concerns around Amanita muscaria, particularly in Australia where it's becoming a weedy species, this is still one of my favourite mushrooms. I love finding it just popping up in suburban gardens and parks near where I live or where I'm travelling. I'd like to thank you for joining in and watching this video, and I'd like to wish you all the best with your foraging. Thank you to Entheogenesis Australis for hosting this video, who they're listed here at the top of this list of Australian organisations and websites. I'd also like to point out PRISM, the Australian Psychedelic Society, DanceWise, and MYCOmmunity Applied Mycology. The corroboree, hosted on Shaman Australis, is a incredible resource that does also go into some aspects of Amanita muscaria. I'm giving you a huge reference list here. So references for Aurora, Cook, Feeney, Heinrich, Wasson, etc. And I'd like to wish you all the best with your foraging, and I'll see you in the forest.